Welcome to Truthverse, a podcast for awakening minds who want to go deep. If you're vibing with the show, please do hit the like and subscribe buttons, and if you could take a few seconds to leave me a review on Apple or Spotify, it's actually super helpful for ranking the show up and getting my work out to more people. And remember, when you do, take a screenshot and send it to me on Instagram for a free thank you gift. For other ways you can support me, check out the show notes. I've listed ways you can do that there. Stay cool. Ladies and gents, welcome to this episode of Truthverse podcast. Obviously, I'm your host, Brendan, and this week I have the pleasure of being joined by Dan Winter himself, or as I have referred to him in print somewhere, Dan Phase Conjugation Winter. And we're going to get into what that means along the way here. But I've known of Dan's work for at least minimum 10 years, 12 years maybe. And he's someone whose stuff you want to know about. You need to know about it, in my humble opinion. And so what is that stuff? We're going to get into that. So without further ado, Dan, I really appreciate you having a chat with me today.
Thank you. And as I said, I really enjoy your Australian accent. It makes me feel at home. All good, you know. Us Mullumbimby people have to hang together after all. And my French is poor anyway, so.
Yeah, right. Okay, well, my Spanish is probably equally bad. So, I'm glad we had the Mullum connection there. So funnily enough, Dan was saying he's partly based over there in Mullumbimby, which is close to where we were living just before we left Australia for Mexico. So funny how the world works. And Dan, so could you maybe give, particularly for those who don't know you yet, and who are maybe being introduced to you and your work for the first time here, what is your background? How did you get into this weird field? So just to preempt you, like for people who don't know, Dan is a pioneer, researcher, thinker, theorist, whatever you want to call it, in the realm of consciousness and the physics of consciousness. And from that extends, many other tangents and subjects like the paranormal and attention and gravity, all these things that tie in. So Dan, how did you get into this amazing world of woo and do what you now do?
Yeah, many of you know me. So fractalfield.com is our main website, and flameinmind.com, our brainwave site, and therify.net, our plasma. And today's subject, in part, my passion currently, physicsofsoul.com, whatever that means. And that's what we do want to get into. So yeah, my background is psychophysiology, University of Detroit. I was a polygraph electrical engineer kind of person. And then I was a trained systems analyst with IBM. And then I was the technical director and inventor of an electric motor generator business in Buffalo, New York for 20 years. And then probably 20 or 30 years on the road teaching physics of consciousness in most every major Western city, actually. And somewhere along the line, I became a biofeedback inventor. And we teach brainwave biofeedback for Bliss, flameinmind.com. And we teach, phase conjugate implosion, fractal fields, as it were, for rejuvenation, which is our therify.net plasma system. And currently we have other smaller systems, piezofire.com, which do piezoelectric capacitive implosion, all of which is based on one very simple idea, that when electric fields become fractal, which is to say implosively compressible, they become negentropic, self-organizing. And that is the turning point. And the serious physics of that is my new book, plankfire.com, Planck, Plankfire, Phire, plankfire.com, my new book in several languages already, which basically says something very simple. If you take the musical key signature of the universe, called Planck, and multiply by whole number powers of golden ratio, fractality perfected, you get almost every known physical variable, which is negentropic self-organizing, the 2 exact frequencies of photosynthesis, 3 exact radii of hydrogen, Earth year, Venus year, galactic year, precessional year, all of the things about physics where charge collapse is enabled. And that's the key word. And please do ask questions about this, but basically physics has agreed charge collapse, implosion of charge, is the cause of gravity and consciousness. Hello, has physics agreed on something? Have you ever heard of agreement? Well, there is agreement. Charge collapse causes gravity and consciousness. The mystery for physics is what causes charge to collapse or implode. And that is the question I have answered, plankfire.com, which is Musical key signature of the universe, Planck, it's 1.61 times 10 to the minus 33 centimeters. Hours of golden mean ratio, which creates perfect nesting, perfect embedding, our star mother kit, all golden ratio. And so that, for example, is a precise model of hydrogen and DNA, Earth grid, zodiac, and all of the fun stuff. And so that creates implosion of charge towards center, which is the cause of gravity. It's the reason gravity is centripetal, and it's the cause of consciousness. And so that's going to lead us to a conversation, which hopefully is even more practical, which is, do we take that information and learn the physics of soul in order to find out why billions of kids are losing their soul right now because science is too stupid to know what a soul is? And that's what I'm passionate about at the moment. So shall I carry on? Or maybe you want to ask some questions first.
Well, I mean, there was a lot in there.
Yeah.
So we could probably spend the next few hours unpacking that opening spiel, but let's do that. Let's start with, I mean, what is the logical launching off point as far as you're concerned there? I'd like to get into the gravity side of it just as one of many things, but I mean, how did you go from your background into this? Like, what you're doing now is kind of like greater than the sum of the parts. What led you into this space in the first place? Did you have some kind of major spiritual awakening event? What was the precipitating factor?
I'm cautious that it might make me sound pretentious, but what I essentially realized, I think it was the day Maurice Cottrell said, these physicists are a pretty arrogant group for not having a clue why objects fall to the ground. And I thought about that for a while, and he was right. I mean, functionally, the physics community on this planet, for not having a clue what electrically causes gravity, what electrically causes consciousness, what electrically causes soul, what electrically causes life, the physics community on this planet appears to not have a clue. And I find that objectionable. I find it shocking, actually. And I decided to look into it, basically. Well, you see, here's how it started. I'll tell you exactly how it started. I had discovered there were equations on the radii of hydrogen showing hydrogen was built on golden ratio, but nobody knew that the radii to center of hydrogen was golden ratio. And I wrote the inverse log function equations taking Planck, which is my intuition of what the center of hydrogen was. Pretty good idea. And powers of Planck predicted 3 hydrogen radii so exactly that no physicist can ignore me. That is a smoking gun. Basically, you take simply spirals of the golden mean and make pentagrams and pentagrams. There's pictures all over my 100 websites. 10 spirals of the golden mean, pentacles inside pentacles, and you get exact, precise physics, top-down view of hydrogen. So then we wrote and published the equations, the generalized wave equations, to prove in general that golden mean ratio, that exponent that fits that all together, that golden mean ratio is the generalized wave solution to constructive wave interference and therefore constructive compression. I repeat, the generalized wave solution to constructive wave interference and therefore the solution to compression. Well, you don't realize how earth-shaking it is to say you have discovered the solution to compression, but I have. I published the first equation. Well, when you got the solution to compression, you got the cause of gravity, the cause of alchemy, the cause of consciousness. The history of the success in compression, the solution to compression, is the history of computing, the history of artificial intelligence, the history of negentropy, the history of alchemy, the history of urban design. It's the only issue to all of those questions, all of the important questions of physics, the origin of negentropy, the solution to compression is the answer to every question. Oh, hello. Implosive compression is the solution to virtually every problem. How do you make life force in a city? How do you make alchemy? How do you make computers? The solution to compression is the answer to everything. How do you electrically get through death? We have the data, I mean the electrical data, to show the way to succeed at death is precisely, and I mean precisely, the electrical solution to compression. I mean, ain't that interesting? I think other things are boring by comparison. That's my humble opinion.
So, okay, so
I'd be pleased to go into that about the physics of successful death because it leads to the physics of soul.
Beautiful, because that is a very strong interest of mine and has been for a long time. So,
Yeah,
what is a successful death then?
absolutely. At least we have the right question. If you talk to Ray Moody, who's a hero, I teach with him in Italy all the time, and he
Ah,
has all these medical surgeons who have documented and proved that death visions are electrically contagious.
yeah.
All of the doctors in the room saw at the moment of death, they saw the same thing. Death visions are electrically contagious. And now he has all these medical surgeons who died for a while and were outside their body and looking at their body from outside their body. I mean, medical top level surgeons have documented what it's like to be outside their body. So anybody pretends to teach a physics of consciousness and cannot explain what goes outside your body when you're looking at your body from outside your body, those people do not have a clue what the physics of consciousness is. Gary Schwartz, Stewart, they don't. They don't have a clue. Actually, I will tell you specifically what goes outside your body. Consciousness is a liquid crystal. It's literally a superfluid plasma vortex that inhabits the array of the net of fireflies of the synapses of your brain. And when you get the synapses of your brain firing correctly, hint, golden ratio cascade of EEG, it squeezes the plasma vortex tornado inside your head to a point. That point is Planck, and that point is called consciousness. And specifically, I, therefore, have for the first time answered the proven physics that focused human attention causes electric fields to compress or implode, Bill Tiller's famous work, Conscious Acts of Creation. So it's obvious. You can measure how conscious you are. It's not subjective. No, you measure literally how centripetal your conscious. That's why when you focus your attention on a seed, it grows faster. It's measurable. When you focus your attention in a cloud, it puts a hole in a cloud. Electrically, that's measurable. So consciousness is electrically implosive. The reason it's implosive is because the golden ratio brainwave cascade from alpha to gamma that causes peak consciousness, peak perception, and surviving death, and lucid dreaming, and clairvoyance. Those harmonic tensors of your brainwave cascade, flameinmind.com, if you'd like to measure, squeeze that plasma vortex tornado to come to the correct point, which is Planck. And at the Planck length, the universe has agreed. That's why Planck is the same for 1 billion light years in all directions. The universe has agreed that longitudinal EMF, incorrectly called scalar waves, propagate constructively if they agree. And they propagate into an array that looks like this, which is called the collective unconscious, communion of saints, song lines, dreaming tracks, or the only places you can measure commercial quality telepathy. They're all the nodes of the Earth grid. They look like this. Those are the longitudinal nodes that bounce around these coherent longitudinal interferometry called the collective unconscious, and where you need to go after compression at death and lucid dreaming and clairvoyance. Anywho, so if you don't get your brainwave harmonics cascade, which is the Schumann cascade, it's the same way as the brainwave, the Bliss, alpha to gamma, it's called a phase conjugate pump wave, and that squeezes the vortex to a point, and then you can embed in that array. Remember that those lucid dreaming, songline dreaming tracks, you're an Australian, you know what that means. That was the only Aboriginal name for God, is what inhabits that songline dreaming track. And when Auntie Lorraine died there outside of Mulham, and the storm went 3,000 miles across the continent, that magnetic line was the family pet of that family, because that's what they held together by the centripetal force of their dreaming. And the frequencies which cause lucid dreaming, documented in university literature, happen to fit my equation, which is why our flameinmind.com and our therify.net plasma triggers lucid dreaming. Because it creates that implosive compression that enables you to embed in that array coherently. So now that we've come full circle to talk about successful death is only and always about successful compression, because that's what gets you into that array. It also tells us now how to release stuck ghosts as well, which Therify Plasma also does. So Heinrich Kluwe famously documented that when you die, remember, just before you die, generally you see your whole life compressed. into a millisecond, right? Well, the reason is your biology knows your only hope of getting into that array, ancestor memory, communion of saints, whatever you want to call it, songline, to embed in that array, you need to be compressed and distributed. And so actually Heinrich Clouvet showed a map. What you see when you die, it's called lattice cobweb tunnel spiral. You can see the graphics, goldenmean.info/immortality. So what your DNA is doing is turning and then turning on itself and braiding on the braid of the braid, imploding, doing the sequence of turns in order to superpose axes of rotation constructively, called going to the next dimension, embedding in there. So you do this compression thing well, and then you can distribute in that array, and then that is actually called heaven, Hey Ave, or Plains of Sharon, Champs-Élysées, Elysian Fields. That is a name for the coherence of that array, which works good in the countryside and works like merde if you're in big cities with metal buildings. So I could carry on, but you see then that actually that's going to lead us to understanding the physics. I do mean the physics of soul, that when you have access to bliss and coherent emotion, and you have access to sacred space, the constructive compression of that magnetic array, like this at the sacred sites, the opposite of what you find in metal cities, then your DNA and your glands gets to implode, compress, and spit out that coherent longitudinal array from the less efficiently propagating transverse EMF, sometimes called scalar. And when your body spits that out, the Egyptians call it the Ba from the Ka. And when I was in the Gurdjieff school, they said, well, you got to be making this stuff if you want to be immortal. It's called the Kesjan body. Well, now we can tell electrical engineers what that is. It's that emitting this coherent longitudinal interferometry, embedding in the array. The Egyptians called it Ba from the Ka. And that is the physics of soul. And if your kids are sticking Bluetooth and Wi-Fi in their ear 12 hours a day, believe me, they're losing their soul. So that's my short version of physicsofsoul.com. I get enthused. What do you think?
I haven't noticed. So, so okay, so in simple terms for people, because you raised the Wi-Fi thing, and that's some people are aware of that as a health issue. What is happening if you can simplify the terminology for people, what's happening when their kid plugs into one of these things or has one nearby? What's happening electrically to their auric field, all this sort of stuff as using this?
Well, taking Bluetooth for an example, it's a very sharp, choppy, high-frequency content, essentially a square wave, very high-frequency content. And my friend Georg was here the other day, and he didn't believe, he sat next to me, and I instantly felt intense nausea and flashes of dizziness, and it was obvious my clairvoyance was going to hell. And I said, Georg, have you got the Bluetooth and Wi-Fi on your phone? He said, blah, 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 blah. And I showed him on his phone, and he was shocked, and he turned it off, and then he sat there depressed for many minutes because he realized that his grandson had been sitting in that for 8 hours a day for years now, and realized that his own grandkids were losing their soul because electrical engineers are too stupid to teach governments what a soul is. That's why our governments are soulless. So I am passionate that we must. So essentially what the successful compression does, you go into a stone circle at a sacred site or an ancient stone circle, so sacred trees, and you sit there and you take a deep breath and you relax, and a twinkle starts inside your head, and your aura gets huge like a rose, and you feel fabulous. And then you go into a metal building in an ugly city with dead air and more Wi-Fi and electrosmog that you shake a stick at. You feel nauseous as hell, and you absolutely cannot focus fluorescent lights in the kids. So everything about the frequencies in their environment, which does not compress well, is destroying soul, because it's destroying your ability to implode. Very practical example. New film just came out. You take the poisonous fluorescent lights out of your kid's classroom and you install sunlight. It's called phase conjugate harmonic inclusiveness. And you measure a dramatic increase in attention span, consciousness, literally. The reason is the harmonics of the sunlight facilitate implosion. And that shitty Bluetooth and electrosmog and fluorescent lights are destroying not just the attention of your kids, but the soul. We can prove it, we can measurement, and we damn well better tell the government quick.
Maybe that's one of the many reasons why school is such a soul-destroying experience for so many people.
Absolutely. Until we can teach our government what soul is, we are condemned to billions of children, literally a soulless planet. This needs to be fixed.
Absolutely. Did you have any thoughts that flow from there, or that you want to continue with, or should I throw something at you?
Well, go ahead. Go ahead. I like spontaneity. Go ahead.
No, well, I mean, speaking, because we talked about successful death, and I feel like this is going to be one of those conversations where we come back to things over and over, which is fine with me. And we mentioned successful death. What is then an unsuccessful death for someone? What is the experience somebody has who is not in that coherent state?
Yeah. Well, I think it might be helpful in that regard to talk about how it is that lucid dreaming predicts successful death.
Okay.
It is notable, and I have slideshows on all this, but we're not going to do slideshows today. It's all in the way. In fact, fractalfield.com/slideshow, and you'll see hundreds of these pictures. So check it out. But the part of that slideshow is you take a picture of somebody just died in a forest, and you can see the soul leaving the body. It's visible in the photograph. Ain't that cool? Now you take the same picture of somebody that just died in a hospital full of metal and electrosmog, and oh shit, nope. You don't see any coherence departing. Why? Because that hospital is the electrical definition of hell. Metal, electrosmog all over, and it's the wrong place to die because you cannot propagate into the array from there. Now, I would recommend the altar at Machu Picchu, but that's just anyway. The reason then lucid dreaming predicts successful death because it essentially means that you've learned to propagate into and leverage coherently into the array. That's why it's so significant that the university studies, and you can see the graphics at luciddreamteam.com. We have a global lucid dream team working on this. But the university study showed the frequencies, electromagnetic, that trigger lucid dreaming, very close to my equation, plankfire.com, which is what we produce with therify.net, doing rejuvenation plasma in 25 countries around the world, triggers lucid dreaming. So lucid dreaming means that obviously you can go someplace during the dream and come back with something testable and real. You met someone, you saw something that's real, it was testable, etc. So lucid dreaming is which is why Jodie Foster discovered in Contact that was she traveling intergalactically or was she lucid dreaming? It started with a dodeca and it was both. So the physics of lucid dreaming is instructive. And then when groups can lucid dream together, and then go through the sun together, that means you're growing up, basically. Any Aboriginal knows. So, anywho, the physics of lucid dreaming predicts successful death because essentially it means this vortex right here that you take with you when you leave your body. I mean, when you leave your body, you are literally the vortex in the center of toroidal ball lightning. And ball lightning, by the way, is famous for responding well to telepathy. So ball lightning is a torus, and it responds to telepathy because the implosion at the center, phase conjugate implode, embeds into the longitudinal array, which is the bloodstream of telepathy. Hello. So basically, successful death is when you can remain centripetal in the array. Sometimes that's called Christos, which is the ability to crystallize, literally to implode, remain centripetal, which is also the definition of crystallization or precipitating. Precipitation in water, why children can put holes in clouds with their attention. So when your attention gets electrically focused enough to maintain that tornado, and then you learn how to steer that tornado, and the shadows of the angle of that vortex are Hebrew and Sanskrit for that reason, because the index to this tilt of tornadoes, you take this tornado here, this spiral on this, and you look at it from the shadows of the tetrahedrons, 7 axes of spin, you have Hebrew and Sanskrit, because somebody was trying to teach us how to visualize the angles of tilt to cook up not just the atomic table, that's how it's cooked, but also how you navigate when you're outside your body. You got to steer the angle of that tornado. That's very important. That's why you memorize the tilt angles of the vortex indexed by Tetracube called Hebrew and Sanskrit. It's because that's how you navigate. It's your celestial inertial navigation system when you're outside your body, which is like when you grow up. Anyway, successful death would then be defined as the ability not just to take memory through death, but to take a charge coherence, which is the same thing, basically. So in another way of saying that, the longer the term the memory, the more their indication is of ability to ride the long wave, which is directly the physics of soul.
Okay, that was a hell of a mouthful.
Oops. I learned to talk fast because I had Kundalini for 30 years. And when you inhabit a lightning bolt, Dannion Brinkley inhabited a lightning bolt. The movie Powder, you inhabit a lightning bolt. If you're doing a dervish turn for your Sufi master, you must prove that you don't get dizzy when you inhabit the spin. And the reason that's proof that you have pure intention is because you can't inhabit the still point without being the shareable wave.
So there was a purpose to all that spinning after all.
That's right. The dervish turn. I was with the Sufis. Long story.
I had a couple of questions that came back to the Sanskrit and Hebrew. What about any, say, death rites that came out of those cultures in connection with the the steering of the Taurus?
People can see the animations of the origin of Hebrew, goldenmean.info/DNA ring. And they'll see all those about there for 20 years. And I wrote the equations and did the 3D animations. So basically, if you think of the Tibetans doing the drumming at death and teaching you about the bardo, they're teaching you to maintain the discipline of your attention. And the discipline of your attention is very much the phase coherence of the longer wave, which is that drum. And by the way, if that drum were done correctly, probably it would relate to the 0.1 hertz Mayer wave, the LF component of HRV, and the most important frequency of the breath and the blood. And so that is the most important frequency of the Kundalini and the spine liquid pump and the breath, and indicates part of how you can keep your attention at death. So there are some rituals that are very useful involving rhythm and symmetry. And if you can die where magnetic lines cross, it's also very convenient to do it at sunset or sunrise and solstice, because you embed better into that array where telepathy works better. Now, a bad time to do it is when the moon blocks the sun, eclipse. That's a hell of a time to do it, because that blocks the longitudinal coherence of the array, which is why you must avoid the moon if you want a seed to germinate.
Okay. And what kind of, too many questions. What kind of experience does someone have if they die under an eclipse event?
Well, most Aboriginal and Indigenous people knew that you literally need to learn to hold your attention, because during the eclipse, the pump wave, which is keeping the gravity wave stable, is cut off. What happens is that the moon is hollow and metal and, quote, artificial, and the opposite of high dielectric, which means that when the moon blocks the sun, the longitudinal component of the sun's electromagnetic, which is what feeds all of biology. You put a copper plate on the roof, wire to the basement, and now all the plants in the basement will grow fine in pitch blackness as long as they're getting the longitudinal wave from the sun. But the moment the moon got in the way, hell no. That's why, actually eclipse is a good time to duck. Now, it's true that you could install a new stone in your stone circle because the pressure in the plumbing is off and you can change the plumbing. So there's some things you can do during eclipse. But generally, they say it's a time to duck, but it's a time when you have to be aware the Earth grid is at max destability. And there are good studies correlating eclipses and the moon to earthquakes for good reason. After you know why objects fall to the ground, after you know that longitudinal coherence is the only stuff gravity waves are made of, Tom Bearden, then you can understand why eclipses destabilize gravity. But of course, if you don't have a clue why objects fall to the ground, you're in trouble.
It may interest you to know, you probably already didn't know, that there is something of a movement in this, like a subset of the truth movement that has taken to the idea that there is no gravity.
No, gravity is very specific. It is a name for the charge acceleration toward center of symmetry. And the reason that exists is because golden ratio only as in the top-down view of hydrogen and the whole atomic table in the Earth grid, the golden ratio is the only approach path to center that allows the waves to add and multiply recursively, constructively, their phase velocities. And only that literally fractal, the cause of gravity, fractality, only that fractal geometry of compression turns compression into acceleration of charge towards center, the recursive heterodyning of those phase velocities, producing acceleration of charge towards center, named the gravity. That is the only definition of gravity, is that acceleration of charge, which Einstein proved. Acceleration was indiscriminable from gravity because acceleration is gravity. Hello. And that charge acceleration is towards center only in the presence of golden ratio fractality, the cause of gravity, which is why, hint smoking gun, golden ratio is the dominant geometry of all orbital mechanics, because it's the only way to stabilize gravity and atmosphere.
Okay, I didn't know. I mean, I might have read it somewhere in your book, but there's a lot of information in there. So, yeah, come back to that. The orbital mechanics being stabilized by fire, by golden ratio.
Absolutely, because spirosolaris.ca is a very good example. Hundreds, if not thousands, of pages documenting that the dominant geometry of all orbital mechanics is golden mean ratio. And I'm the one who wrote the equation to prove golden ratio is the dominant geometry of hydrogen. And by the way, by stellation principles, therefore, golden ratio is because all of electron shells and all of the nuclear hadrons always and only, and we can prove it, nest only in this geometry. SBDF subshells, that's exactly what this is. Nuclear hadron symmetries in the nucleus, moon chemistry, exactly this. So Kepler said, gravity, planetary orbitals are a nest of platonics. Well, he was right, because nest of platonics makes golden ratio, that makes implosion, and that causes and stabilizes gravity. Hello, it's simple. A 5-year-old could explain it. So once you know why objects fall to the ground, then you can know why only stable orbital mechanics can be maintained by golden ratio. Hint, if you'd like to maintain gravity, negentropy, atmosphere, and consciousness. Hint, Gaia is proven to be negentropic. Lovelock. Well, how did Gaia, the grid looks like this, get negentropic? Golden ratio implosive charge collapse.
Mm-hmm. There are a few thoughts that occurred to me as you were talking there. Now I'm forgetting most of them. What was it I want to hone in on? Well, okay, I'll come back to because we started on the death thing. So dying with an eclipse event. So the moon is in the way of the sun. It's now interfering. It's blocking the longitudinal waves, the long waves coming through. So now the individual can't embed themselves into that array. So they are essentially, how do you see the result of that? It's kind of like likely to become an earthbound kind of a spirit? How does it shape up?
That's the right question. Since we're talking about physicsofsoul.com, very relevant question. So let's take the example. Multiple users have reported practically that our Therify.net phase conjugate plasma is a useful tool for releasing stuck ghosts. Actually, or if you happen to have a little Bliss handy, that will work good also.
Right, exactly.
So what that means is just that when you die, if you did not get your electric field implosively arranged, like it was a disorderly death. By the way, for example, love, because the ratio of the waveform of touch that says love is precisely golden ratio, love compresses perfectly, but anger, it's a 1/7 wave ratio, the physics of the wave mechanics of emotion, Centix, goldenmean.info/touch. So anger, you cannot compress that. That means if you got anger at death, man, you ain't going to compress well. You ain't going to implode well. You ain't going to distribute. You ain't a shareable wave. Oops. So essentially, the physics of stuck ghosts is the residual plasma that could not embed and distribute into the array. So they need a electric field which is implosive enough to help them do that compression to embed into that array. And there are various tools, plasma, your Bliss, lots of ways. But the physics is quite clear. If you didn't get compression going good at the time of death, you're going to need some help.
Right. And that is interesting. That comes up in the literature. People who, for example, mediums who channel spirits, the ones who aren't full of shit. And one of the classic examples was actually Lawrence of Arabia, who I'm sure everyone's heard of. And he had a sudden death, and not a very pleasant one, and he died with a lot of unresolved emotional issues, and so didn't have the best crossing over type experience, and actually was kind of stuck at a relatively low level of the like dimensional spectrum, if I can put it that way.
It's a very useful example. I haven't studied, but very useful. So essentially, that's why practicing lucid dreaming is so helpful. You'll find, for example, that if you made a magnetic map of your bed, it's going to help you lucid dream. Because you need the place that looks like a rose to do it good. That's also the physics of telepathy. And we proved it. Korotkov and Kozyrev proved telepathy happens at magnetic line cross points. Hint, longitudinal coherence. So you can plan for lucid dreaming and you can plan for successful death if you know a little bit about the physics, actually, because you got to do compression good. And then you enable distribution. That's called communion of saints, or, Akashic records. We have so many names for them, but where are the electrical engineers teaching governments what soul is, so we stop having soulless governments? That's my question.
Yes. I think the people invested in the current system wouldn't take too kindly to that.
Hello.
They're making too much money from being soulless.
Well, actually, conspiracy theory aside, and you can't put it aside because it's huge, but I'm of the conviction that the word evil doesn't barely apply. I use the word stupid usually.
Usually, yeah. Yeah. No, I completely agree. Yeah, I mean, look, that's been my observation from
education is the issue.
Right, right.
But that's education.
I mean, overwhelmingly, like there is obviously we know there are conspiracies and different groups and subgroups and stuff, but yeah,
some big evil whatever.
Yeah. If it would never work, they would never have the influence they have if people weren't so stupid, so to speak.
Well, and maybe we should go there briefly.
Let's do it.
Are you familiar with Elena Danan's work on the Galactic History?
Which I know who she is and what she talks about, but I haven't gone into it.
I've been co-teaching with her for many years.
Ah.
And the view there was, after you looked into Anne Rice describing the largest plasma parasite in the solar system, Enkil, the father of all vampires, literally as Enlil Yahweh, and who we now know was half Draco, we know where he came from, et cetera, et cetera. So, the solar system was dominated by a huge plasma parasite for thousands of years, actually. And, blood thickens. Anne Rice had a lot of that right, actually. But how do you get to be the largest plasma parasite in the solar system? The Grim Reaper, literally, it's like Ascended Masters. If you had gold powder addiction and you never learned to make your own bliss, then you're always relying on eating the aura of others, really. Mm-hmm. So actually electrically, the first moment that you're not a parasite technically is the moment you learn to have your own source of bliss, which is literally the own source of charge. And that's the point here. We could go into Galactic History, and I recommend it. My extensive 100 recordings on the physics of the galactic ET history of DNA is fractalfield.com/fusion in the blood. And obviously I have opinions on this, but whether or not you believe in Elena Danaan, and I think she got a lot right, it isn't about do you believe on which Draco was what. And by the way, Enlil was half Draco, and that's the problem. And the Draco Wars, Siakar, are dominating the solar system. No, the galaxy right now, if you happen to be interested in the story, and that's the story of Thoth. We're not going to go there in the ET history. And the ET history is useful and interesting and instructive, but it's not a requirement. No, but the requirement to graduate, actually is the physics of soul and the physics of bliss, because without that, you don't graduate. So we don't really care whether you believe in whose physics of the galactic history. It's colorful, instructive, useful. However, but the required course is how to get enough bliss to lucid dream coherently and take memory through death, called physicsofsoul.com. That's a required course.
Mic drop. So with like you were talking about the drum, people like the Tibetans using the drum and stuff. So yeah, if they are successful in inducing the bliss and the coherence, and they make it to the point of embedding in the longitudinal array, is that where the ground luminescent dawns on them, so to speak?
Well, I think it's documented that when Tibetan saints dies, you get rainbows. And I'm the first to document the physics of why. So the centripetal force of the aura is the physics of the reason rainbows exist. Fractalfield.com/fractal photosynthesis. So we know exactly what causes rainbows after you know that phase conjugation is the reason color exists. Hint, the exact two frequencies that cause photosynthesis just happen to be precisely golden ratio toward times Planck, planckfire.com. So phase conjugate fractal optical wave interference is the reason photosynthesis and hint color exist. Then you might get a clue why the death of a really good Tibetan causes rainbows. Hello. So they call that the rainbow light body by coincidence.
Yep. Yeah. Right. Exactly.
Longitudinal coherence.
Yes. And okay, I wanted to go back to some other things, but please continue on any tangent you like. Oh, okay. So one of the things you mentioned, which, we're covering so much ground, it's ridiculous. And I'm very aware that many of my listeners are hearing terminology that is flying at them at a phenomenal pace. And they're going, what was that? What was that? But okay, so sometimes circling back is useful. Orbital mechanics, what you were talking about there, does that connect in with, and something I haven't looked at for a long time, but Bode's law, so to speak, is that related or not so much?
Well, so there was Bode's law was that the area traversed in the rotation of the planet is equal over time. So it speeds up and slows down as the planet gets closer and farther away, but the area traversed in the quadrant is equal. So that's called Bode's law. Now that's an introduction, but more usefully here, for example, that the orbital mechanic of Venus with respect to Earth and indirectly Mars is precisely golden ratio based, pentacles inside pentacles. So the physics here is that actually orbital mechanics has to be fractal golden ratio based or gravity will not be stable. And even more profoundly, as we look at the fact that Schumann harmonics, the dominant harmonics of Schumann, is a perfect Caduceus of golden ratio times Planck, called a precisely tuned phase conjugate pump wave called Schumann harmonics, which is the reason pyramids work, literally. pyramidwirelesspower.com. Check it out. You measure the low frequencies in pyramid, phase conjugate pump wave. It's imploding the local electromagnetics into a longitudinal coherent pump wave out the center, distributed into the array, called pyramidwirelesspower.com, which only works because the Schumann harmonic cascade is a precisely tuned phase conjugate pump wave, golden ratio times Planck. Hello, is that a coincidence? No. Hermes and his team spent about 500,000 years getting that set up correctly. But it just happens that those exact same Schumann harmonic cascade is exactly the harmonics alpha, beta, gamma that make brain waves turn into bliss and peak perception and clairvoyance. And by the way, teleportation. So yeah, this is actually the physics of global wireless power, truly.
Okay, let's talk more about since you're talking about the pyramids, what is the purpose there of those pyramids as such? Because I think it's multi-layered, right?
Well, I think pyramids have been installed on, of course, I think probably billions of planets. It was traditional at a time when a planet, in this case, Earth, many parts of the Galactic Federation was involved in installation of pyramids here over probably millions of years. It's clear there's millions literally around the planet, but you need to know what they are. A pyramid is called a gravity diode. I recommend the book 2/3 David Myers and David Percy, well reviewed at pyramidwirelesspower.com, my website. So essentially, the pyramids were called also the Hummer because the reason they're humming is the piezoelectric compression wave is humming with the Schumann harmonics, the low frequencies. We measured those, by the way, in Sam's Bosnian pyramid. And he's got, a million people around the world getting rejuvenation there regularly. So not only are we distributing global wireless power into the array, because the gravity diode is taking the incoherent transverse, imploding it with a Schumann phase conjugate pump wave into that coherent distribution, named a gravity diode, a one-way gate. And the reason it's a gravity diode is gravity is made, Tom Bearden, gravitobiology, gravity is made of coherent longitudinal interferometry. Hello, the only physics of action at a distance. And the climax of all what physics called entanglement is actually the embedding, which phase conjugation perfects. So, they ain't quite figured what action at a distance is yet, but this longitudinal coherence is. So anyway, a gravity diode is literally the ability to take the incoherent transverse EMF, implode it, and squirt gun out the nozzle of the squirt gun, the pine cone, at Planck threshold, coherent longitudinal EMF, and pump that into the array. And now anytime you put a pyramid around the planet, you can pick it up. So not only are you getting global wireless power, but also you are stabilizing gravity and atmosphere. And that was critical at the time when the Galactic Federation had just nuked the hell out of the solar system, trying to bomb the damn reptilian Dracos out of here. The Anunnakis were not popular at that time. And even though Enki was running Atlantis, they bombed the shit out of him, and he had to skip town. His brother Enlil Yahweh orchestrated that mess. But the short summary is the planet didn't even have a moon before then. They had to stick that in here to stabilize the joint, and they had to retune a bunch of pyramids. Well, you stick the gravity diodes there, because otherwise than that, bye-bye atmosphere.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah. All right. It's what comes off of that, what follows for you there from there, because there's just so much happening. Keep talking, Dan.
but just to say that, when I laid down in the sarcophagus in the king's chamber and the lights went out, actually, it was weird. You feel that icy coldness. What you find is this is also a squirt gun for your aura. Mm-hmm. And, when we measured Jean-Charles Moyen's brainwaves just before he teleported multiple times with witnesses and came back with sand from the beach between his toes, witness documented teleportations. And we know the brainwave signature that made that possible. He imploded into the array. The documentation is at flameinmind.com/lucidbrain. So basically, the same harmonic cascade of implosion, well tuned in a pyramid, is a squirt gun for your aura. Mm-hmm. And this was, obviously, if you needed to commute back and forth to Orion, for example, you needed something efficient.
Right. Okay. So, there's a whole subject in itself. Let's talk a little bit about that, like the physics of the teleportation system. Who's teleporting where? How far back does this go, in your opinion? Let's talk a little bit about it. It's tangent, but it's a very interesting one.
Well, I think one of the most instructive stories is when Elena Danaan is teaching how the Enlil Yahweh's father, Anu, got tricked into marrying this horrible Draco bitch, who was then the mother of Enlil Yahweh. They offered him ownership of the trapezium in Orion, the biggest stargate, and the subject of the Orion Wars. Hello, what were the wars over? The Stargate. Jerusalem, Uru Asa Lm Uru, ancient Stargate, Asa, queen of El, phase shift. Jerusalem. So the war is always over the Stargate. The biggest one is the trapezium, which is a cube. Ooh, phase conjugate, four-wave mixing. Hello. Mm-hmm. So you get enough mass cubically arranged and you can implode. And so essentially what it is the more harmonics of golden ratio times Planck you embed and implode, the more the phase velocities, which are always golden ratio multiples of c, the speed of light, as Professor Raymond Chow measured. The smoking gun proof of my theory of gravity is that Raymond Chow's measurement of the dominant velocities faster than the speed of light he's ever measured are about golden ratio times the speed of light. Hello, is that a smoking gun that I'm right? Oh, yeah. Mm-hmm. So the more harmonics faster than the speed of light by golden ratio, the farther your Stargate goes. Ooh. Mm-hmm. And the trapezium in Orion is a tetracube, it's called. Four-wave mixing and how you make lasers phase conjugate. Literally, sacred four directions. Mm-hmm. So basically, when you create the conditions for that implosion, the more inertia that can embed in that array, and you need the coordinates in that array. But we essentially know the physics of stargates once you understand the physics of all action at a distance, which Einstein incorrectly called spooky because he didn't have a clue why objects fall to the ground. Coherent longitudinal interferometry. So once you know the physics of all action at a distance, coherent longitudinal interferometry, which conventional physics called entanglement and wormholes, We know that entanglement is just an approximation of phase conjugation perfected, which is embedding perfected. Then you can understand. So how do you remain coherent as you propagate into that array? Hint, Jodie Foster was learning to lucid dream. I mean, she entered a dodecahedron. I mean, she was in contact.
Right, exactly. So is this a crossover point then? We're talking about aliens, ETs, so to speak, on the one hand, and then this lucid dreaming afterlife connection on the other hand. This is kind of where it all meets, it sounds like, in the way you're putting it together.
Yes, literally inhabiting implosion, like Daniel Brinkley, after about 2 or 3 near-death experiences due to lightning, he was doing the same thing the Dervish Master is doing, is learning how to inhabit a spin. And then everyone he would touch after his near death, he would feel every peak emotion of their life, because his DNA was literally electrically superconductive, which you can measure with an amperage surge in DNA or gold monofilament during crystallization, actually. So he was literally a superconductor. So or the movie Powder is a precise example of that physics as well. So the ability to inhabit the center of that lightning bolt, which is literally the more bliss you can inhabit, it's literally Kundalini up your tailbone, the more you can inhabit and embed in that array, and you become centripetal in a larger and larger array. And that's called the physics of Christos.
Well, okay. Christos, Kundalini, I was going to come back to this stuff, and you've brought it up again. So can we talk about that? Can we pull on those threads a little bit? Christos, Christ, and Kundalini, because there's a lot of nonsense said about Kundalini out there, but you've explained it from the perspective of physics and electrical implosion. So I'd love to hear you kind of like just talk a little more about that.
Well, our professional documentary and extensive equations and documents of the frequency signature of Kundalini, which is the sacrocranial frequencies, and the documentaries are all at goldenmean.info/Kundalini, my 30 years or more of that experience. And basically, you feel lightning bolt up your tailbone, and we measured it in the microwave. It's 1.91 angstroms, and we know why. It's because the spine liquid pump, the harmonics of which is called the sacrocranial tidal frequencies, which happen to be exactly golden ratio times Planck, surprise, surprise, which is the breath frequencies, which are also golden ratio times Planck. So your spine liquid pump is the snake charmer, and it's taking the ultraviolet component of cellular metabolism, literally the blue fire sex juice, and pumping it back up to tailbone. And it can kill you, or it can implode in your brain and create very fast talking, as in my case. but actually, what happens is the top of your head, and Valerie will document, the top of your head, it gets pointed, quite a sharp one. And you can feel during Kundalini a very strong negative ion wind, actually. And it does have an effect on clouds. It does have critical mass. People will get headaches it is, I was there when they were drinking Muktananda's bathwater, and I kind of figured out why.
Right, okay.
So basically, the syrup of that implosion is contagious. It's why you worship saints. But when you grow up, you realize that all forms of miracle and personality worship are pure childishness, very disempowering. The physics of Kundalini is highly instructive, but it does boil down to the ability to inhabit a lightning bolt, actually. And you sit in that stillness, and your intuition tells you when to stop. Otherwise, you're dead. But then as you sit in that stillness, your mentation speeds up, your thoughts speed up. And you learn that you can only be thinking about pure principle, essence. Otherwise, it will generate heat and kill you, which is a good introduction to death, actually.
Okay. Well, please continue.
So after my Kundalini started at the Gurdjieff School, Claymont.org in West Virginia, and we were doing the Gurdjieff gymnastics and living in a country house and eating a very pristine diet, actually. And I had got the hell out of the big city, Detroit. And after a few months of that, I started having some Kundalini, actually, which was in some ways more fun than sex, but perhaps even more dangerous.
Yeah.
Then I was adopted actually by Itzhak Bentov, who wrote the book on the biomechanics of Kundalini, Stalking the Wild Pendulum, extensively featured at goldenmean.info/Kundalini, and worked in his lab with the capacitive accelerometer, which we then did use to measure, for example, not just the sacrocranial frequencies, but when you're having bliss, your ears ring. We measured that. We measured the frequencies heard, the ringing in the ears, which is the voice of ancestors, sometimes called Sangreal, the physics of ancestor memory, actually. So we measured the frequencies by a tuning audio oscillator ringing in the ears heard by Bliss meditators. And then we did a chart, and then I calculated the harmonics, and guess what? Plonfire.com. So the ventricle horns crystallize, and the rotation of that current, it's called a homuncula, it's a toroid, implodes. And you could say it's all in your head, but the magnetic map of where you're feeling lightning go up your tailbone is actually a magnetic map of the homunculus on the surface of the brain. Is it all in your head? It's both. But it's a strong magnetic current, and that implosion has great effects on the environment and will generate cities for better city.
City is the superpowers, yeah.
Yes, right. And in my case, it was more clairaudience than clairvoyance. But I began to hear ancestors. We were living on Cherokee Sacred Burial Ground in West Virginia, in North Carolina. And yeah, I heard ancestors actually. And I'm not disciplined about it, but I have some fairly good clairaudience and some fairly lousy clairvoyance. We teach the physics of what this is. This is prehending the coherence of the longitudinal wave. So, for example, when these children, we're teaching them to see without their eyes, blindfolded, which is very famous, well-known, flameinmind.com/outer vision. So you get the same golden ratio cascade, alpha to gamma. It's a golden ratio and octave cascade. Your brain is imploding, and then you can see without your eyes. But the cool thing is you teach kids to do this, and they love it. And then they start seeing their ancestors, and the parents freak out. I think that's fun. And the reason they're seeing their ancestors is because that longitudinal EMF coherence is the physics of clairvoyance and the physics of ancestors. Hello, the Aboriginals knew. Now electrical engineers should.
Right, exactly. Yeah, and I've watched friends. I've got friends, the Wigglesons who live nearby me, and I've seen the two boys who I think are 12 years old play video games completely blindfolded, and it just messes. Some people can't handle it. It's because it's like they are actually seeing every detail on that screen, and I've put the blindfold on. You can't see anything physically through it at all.
It can be tricky, and there has been confusion because actually some blindfolds, there's a pinhole of light, and you can actually see through a pinhole, and that has confused people, and people have manipulated that. And pinhole vision is also interesting, but also there are those who have real vision blindfolded, and that is related to clairvoyance intimately, because what happens is then your aura has imploded. You've got enough focus. In fact, we actually see with Vindor, who works with our group in Netherlands, you watch the brainwave cascade, alpha to gamma. It's literally a vortex in the brainwave harmonics. You see it at flameinmind.com, and she's there doing work, seeing without her eyes, and then she takes a pause, and she's nuts, and the brainwave, literally, the tornado disappears in her brainwaves. And then you put her back to work, seeing with her eyes, and you see. So she actually goes into this bliss state. And when Karakov first measured golden ratio in brainwaves for a World Without Blindness project in St. Petersburg, the way the kids were taught to go into that bliss state of mind, literally a form of trance, they were taught, it's helpful. You can use flameinmind.com and help to learn alpha, beta, gamma, and it is useful. But you know what the kids were taught? It was cheaper. Teach the kids to imagine they're in beautiful nature. And that flips a switch, and your body starts imploding. It's sort of like giving a baby a pacifier. It thinks there's real milk in there. For a while, that works. Well, but the point is, if your body knows that it's in beautiful nature, it is going to flip a switch and start imploding, because that is mother's milk. Absolutely.
Yep. And speaking of the Caduceus and we're flying through so much here, but the Caduceus, and how do we end up with, like the symbol of the guys, Asclepius or something? How do we get there? I mean, how do you think people ended up with that symbol? I mean, it is the implosion sort of graph that you're talking about, the cascade effect. I mean, how did that come from such a, what was it, 2,000, 3,000 or more years ago? What do you think led into that, or how do we end up with it?
Well, I did a recent new documentary on a new history of Thoth Hermes, where the Caduceus is called phase conjugation. And then I revolved the perfected Caduceus, which is literally the side view of a golden mean spiral down a perfect cone of implosion, 60-degree cone, the perfect capacitor to make rain, incidentally. And you take the side view of a golden spiral on that cone, and that is the perfect Caduceus. And then you revolve that, and you get a cup within a cup. It's literally the only possible three-dimensional fractal, and literally it is the Holy Grail. found at goldenmean.info/grail. I wrote all the equations, did all the computer animations. So yeah, we know exactly what the Caduceus is. It's precisely phase conjugate charge collapse perfected. There is no ambiguity. So we have not just now told the medical profession what their logo is for. New information.
Right. And how they can start actually healing people.
Well, which is to say, introduce the electric fields which cause negentropy.
Yes.
Therify.net being just one example, piezofire.com being another, plasmafire.com. We have a half a dozen. We're continuing.
I did want to ask you something that flowed on from that. What were we talking about?
The history of, well, so Thoth Hermes, just to say, who's largely credited with the idea of the Caduceus, actually was the alchemy teacher, original name Ishka, who came with Enki, Osiris, Ea, here. And what does alchemy teacher mean, actually? It means instruction in the art of non-destructive compression, literally negentropic implosion, the origin of all life force. So the metaphor, what's behind Thoth Hermes, which we represent here, this is what we're here to be. We are here to be what Thoth Hermes was here to teach, the physics of the origin of life. Absolutely.
And so, yeah, I mean, this ties back into the Holy Grail and the Christ or Christos, and that we are, based on what you're saying, to follow along, we are supposed to be the Holy Grail, to put it
the
one
Holy
way.
Grail. The Holy Grail electrically and measurably happens in the DNA as you measure the DNA coherently, recursively braid in the presence of love. Actually, it's a phonon cascade from the EKG and the EEG, which measurably cause the DNA to recursively braid implode, shortwave to long wave to longer wave, thread to string to rope to fat rope, a braid on a braid, called going to the next dimension, which is that phase discipline that enables you to have implosion called a soul. The graphics are at goldenmean.info/DNA manifesto. Many graphics, you'll see all the pictures there. So the process of participating, that the map to that superposed axis of spin is literally the Holy Grail in the blood. It's quite literal, and it's perfect physics. So, and from there, it's like the Lord of the Ring. If you don't have pure intention, you can't inhabit the center of that lightning bolt. So the metaphors all fit together.
Yeah. And forgive me for being so vague. I think I've got a deficit of blood going to my brain at the moment. But I just keep having questions and I keep forgetting what they are. It must be early onset Alzheimer's or something, or a lack of bliss. Maybe it's the electrosmog in the room with me. So there's just so many great things that are being tied together here, and I keep just skipping all over the shop. But I I'm happy for you to just jump in where four-way of mixing. That was one thing I wanted to mention. So I don't know if you know a guy called Jürgen Ziwe. But he's a veteran out of body, type explorer type, one of these people who's, afterlife realms, very familiar with it to a degree that's not common at all, even amongst those people. And one of the things he talked about in one of his books was he asked in this out of body altered state to be shown the origin of creation, right? And what happened was something very unexpected. And he and this is not verbatim, but he basically had an experience of being shown four waves coming together and converging. And I was like, four-way of mixing. He doesn't know what he's just experienced.
That's a beautiful metaphor and very appropriate. So yeah, actually, if you want lasers to phase conjugate, the reason it's called four-wave mixing is you've got these lasers which are exactly 180 degrees out of phase, and they have to meet each other from opposing directions at exactly cubic angle, literally called four-wave mixing. And when the lasers meet in that, and then they need a permissive material called phase conjugate dielectric, super dielectric, permission to distribute charge efficiently. In barium, strontium, titanate is example. But what Nostradamus put at the bottom of his scrying cup, or how the Aztec obsidian mirror worked for ancestor phone calls, these are all about phase conjugate mirrors. And so what happens there is then the pine cones can kiss noses accurately at the Planck threshold and implode, and there is perfect distribution of charge at specifically the Planck threshold, the center of that pine cone. And that, phase conjugate optics, is the first time physics ever measured negentropy and time reversal. So that is a perfect introduction, actually, to the origin of creation, precisely That's how stargates work. That's how the opposing hemispheres of the brain have to work if they want to implode at the pineal. It's all the same. And it's why the ancestors worshipped, sacred four directions. So,
Yes.
and the accuracy at which the lasers have to meet is angstrom level,
Wow.
which means, you really need to line things up accurately if you want to get that perfected implosion. And the reason so for example, if you bounce a third laser off that meeting point, that third laser will go backwards in time and become negentropic. Now, what they mean by backwards in time is interesting. They call it time reversal. But what they found out is they can time reverse rusted steel back to unrusted, but you cannot do the opposite. In other words, you cannot go backwards in time toward disorder. It doesn't work.
Yeah.
You can only go backwards in time toward order. What that means is that neg entropy and time reversal have electrically basically the same meaning. It's a very interesting thing.
Yeah, absolutely. That is fascinating in itself. So that also relates, correct me if I'm wrong, but that seems to connect on some level to the sonoluminescence. Is that more or less a similar thing where they line up the laser light in such a precise way that, the sound waves, they were lining up sound waves and they all converged to a point, and then a ball of light started to emerge. This seems like...
Well, the connection there is rather indirect. Sonoluminescence is more parallel to the physics of piezoelectricity, which is effective in quartz and DNA. Basically, piezoelectric means simply the mechanical pressure called stricture because of the slinky, and always there is helicity in the piezoelectric, whether it's DNA or SiO2 in quartz. So the reason it's piezoelectric is the symmetry discipline of the helix. And so when you press on the sides of that slinky with an electric voltage, the ends of that slinky will go up and down in phase with, but in a longer wave. So you've connected a short wave to a long wave, the short wave being voltage and the long wave being sound. And so the connection between sound and light, making a trip between the long wave and the short wave. And that's an introduction of a connection of sound and light. And it's very useful. And if you extend that principle of piezoelectric then to braiding, you can actually begin to talk about implosion. But
yeah. Well, that comes back to what you're talking about with DNA braiding and implosion there. So was there anything you wanted to add along those lines?
Well, just back to one thing that you were talking about, the principle of Christos or Christ.
Yes.
It's a very useful metaphor just because the Christ principle is actually a name for whoever is most centripetal in your array. So, when Bill Tiller measured that focused attention caused charge to compress, conscious acts of creation, he measured it 100 ways. Well, the Christ is the name for whoever's centripetal in your neighborhood. And to get centripetal, it means your aura has to be imploding, which essentially means bliss, which is only a name for charge radiance. So that ability to get centripetal, we have a bumper sticker called Get Centripetal or Get Dead. But a prime example is a seed will not germinate unless it really sucks, which is to say implodes. So we know exactly why pyramids were used to cause seeds to germinate, and Theraphyte on that does a very good job of triggering seed germination, because any centripetal field increases the centripetal force of that seed and its ability to germinate. Also, if you want a child, have access to bliss. So you provide a centripetal field called life, and you get access to bliss and life force and seed germination. So they made measurements. All of the ancient stone circles, sacred sites, and pyramids, they didn't build them primarily for people to go there and die. No, they built them primarily to zap their seeds. It's called Seeds of Knowledge. There's a famous book. So, we now understand what causes seeds to grow. It's implosion, actually.
Yep. Okay, let me have okay. Speaking of, again, tangent, but circling back, speaking of successful death and dying, and the physics that you've just outlined, you were friends with Dan Strieber? Am I saying it right? Or Schreiber?
Oh, Danny Schreiber.
Yes. Forgive me. And I remember I found on one of your web pages a little while back, there was an exchange between you and I think it was Fiona about Dan crossing over. And I thought that was fascinating because it seemed as if we were getting, from the other side of the veil, confirmation of exactly what you were talking about. At least that was the information coming through Fiona from Dan.
That's a beautiful story. And well, we have to credit Fiona very carefully here. I believe she was his lucid dreaming partner. Uh,
Ah,
but essentially, when Dan came back to her after death, we learned something new. He said basically after death that not only was that sequence of lattice cobweb tunnel spirals, the geometric visions Heinrich Kluwe associated with near-death experiences in thousands of trials, but he said there was something else. He said there was a sequence of low-frequency sounds,
uh-huh.
the hum, the hummer, and we now know exactly that physics as well. And we could actually design the electrical hum to help people through death now that we understand that physics. Because it's actually the sequence of heterodynes required to implode DNA in the phonon. We know so much about how, when you have love in your EKG, realheartcoherence.com, we measured the resulting grading in DNA triggered by EKG coherence. I discovered the word heart coherence because I discovered how to measure it, realheartcoherence.com. So we actually know why there's a hum you hear, a deep and throbbing hum as you go through the implosion of death. And Danny Schreiber, after death, brought that to our attention. And we're very grateful, very grateful. I can feel him now.
Hmm. Yeah, that was powerful. That was powerful to read.
He's a hero. He's a hero.
Yeah, from the other side as well. And he went far too young, far too young. But
Exactly.
yeah, thanks for sharing that. I appreciate that.
Yeah.
Um, where does that lead us, if anywhere that you wanted to maybe pick up or just throw additional, throw some additional extended tangents at us in connection?
Well, probably as we reach a climax of this conversation, we should maybe focus on what are the practical suggestions here, actually.
Absolutely.
What are
Yeah.
the practices? And obviously, live food diet, and you really need to work hard at finding a living environment that's not so shockingly polluted, particularly electrosmog. I mean, getting the Wi-Fi and Bluetooth out of your house urgently is actually, if you want your kids to have a soul, hello. When the guy came to install our optical fiber here, supposed expert, and he turned on the Wi-Fi, and we immediately felt waves of incredible nausea. And we ran out of the house and begged him. Of course, he, being the optical fiber installer and expert, did not know that we could use it without Wi-Fi. He didn't have a clue. But we found the button on the damn box to turn off that shitty Wi-Fi and used Ethernet cables. Hello. And now
Amazing.
our house is fine.
Yeah, right.
But this is an example that you really need to work to get a living space that's not absolutely cremated with, it's called Linky here in France, where your electric meter is spinning. And we bought $500 filters to filter the RF out of the Linky, the electric meter. And, it takes work to get and then you need to find out how to ground all the electric appliances in your house properly. And it takes experts to do that well. But really, once you find a way to get a space in which your aura can unpack, it's a turning point in your life. It's urgent if you want your kids to have a soul. So yeah, there's some suggestions here. My early book on the science of bliss hygiene for kids, called Conscious Kids, is at goldenmean.info/conscious kids, in which there's lots of hygiene suggestions. But you can imagine, every time you pick who to hug or who to kiss or what broccoli to eat, you're actually seeking charge. What does that mean? It means genetic diversity. It means hug those with twinkle in their eye.
Well said. As far as other practical considerations, I mean, you're talking about getting the, cleaning up the living space, getting rid of the unnecessary background EM pollution. What else? As far as what about from the perspective of optimizing your implosive quality?
Yeah, well, the other very dominant note there is the ability to do some dowsing, actually. I would say it's a dominantly required skill to begin to learn to find bliss in your life. It's equivalent to kind Castaneda saying you need to find the place of power before you sit down in any room, he meant the place of charge implosion, which is often related to the place where you can make an echo. Because the perfect echo is the name for successful death, actually, which is why in Meetings with Remarkable Men, the Sufi saint was the one who could make an echo. Well, a perfect echo is an introduction to perfect charge distribution, actually, heaven. So what that means is that practically, the more you have access to some bliss process, you will find yourself becoming more sensitive to dowsing. And ultimately, it means if you cannot feel a magnetic line, an earth magnetic line, for example, then you cannot feel in general. And the reason that the more bliss you have increases your dowsing skill is because it braids your DNA and becomes a better antenna. I used to have to walk across the magnetic lines with my arms out and feel my hair stand up. And it's cool, it works. I never used dowsing rods. But then I found after 30 years of some bliss process, that I can walk up to just about any field and ask my inner voice and turn my head up antenna, and I will be directed to exactly where the magnetic line cross is in that giant field. And we have done some powerful rainmaking here in South France, and I have lucid dreamed some of that, actually. But I'm just mentioning that to say, to work on the ability to feel magnetic lines. It's literally your connection to Earth Mother's milk. DNA radio is all of that. So for example, find a place with strong magnetic lines, walk slowly across them, and feel the tingle in your hands as you do that, and tune up that skill. Then, as Gary Skillen used to say, don't tell me who's sick in this house. He would go and make a magnetic map of everybody's bed, and then he would tell you who's sick. Then next step is make a magnetic map of your bed, your house, and your village, and rearrange it to look like a rose, and then you're done. Prague looks like a rose because it's a meteoritic caldera, and I lucid dreamed there, actually. And it attracts tourists and money. It's Implosion.
Beautiful. Well, that's awesome for people to note that there is this practical aspect. I'm sure that people are going to be relieved to feel like we can ground this very cerebral sort of conversation that's just happened, and so many ideas flying us from Dan. With that, reaching the sort of the logical concluding point, mate. What would you like to, or where would you like to encourage people to go to check out more of your work?
Yeah, well, you've
been saying links the whole way through, right? But if you had to prioritize a couple of them, say, and I'll include all this stuff in the show notes, of course.
Yeah, well, our online university has gone viral, fractalu.com, and our YouTube channel, Dan Winter Fractal Field, has 400 films, 3 million views, and 50,000 subscribers. So we have a lot of material shareable. Actually, there was one more thing I wanted to talk about, which is that as you're learning to dowse, this may be the final thought. Just we were recently told by a very sensitive Georg Gaupen, the group that does Emota's work in Austria, you find your magic tree, and you go and you have, you sit under the tree. The long wave Schumann harmonics in ancient old trees is beautifully initiatory, and then you learn to visualize and send prayers or thank yous to that tree from a distance regularly, actually. And you actually learn to talk to trees. And there's wonderful groups, olive trees, they talk to ancient trees. But learn to talk to ancient trees. Actually, learn to find your ancient tree and talk to it. And when we say pray to it, it's almost the right word. It's you're sending this gratitude. And there will be a phase lock such that the depth of the long wave of that tree will profoundly repair the immune system, almost any disease. Seriously, do this experiment in your life. Find your favorite ancient tree, embed phase lock, and learn to visualize and send thank yous to it from a distance. And you will find an incredible resource and relationship to the long wave of trees and the ancient wisdom of Earth. So that's one little hint. We've learned that so recently. It's so incredibly powerful. So
amazing. Get out there and talk to a tree, ladies and gents, please.
And now our work measuring how trees do that, goldenmean.info/trees and flameinmind.com/lifeforce. So yeah, we have a lot of material out there, but the YouTube channel, fractalfield.com, fractalu.com, flameinmind.com. Yeah, you'll see all the links.
Beautiful. Awesome. Well, I mean, wrapping up here, Dan, I really appreciate that. I know we could go for days here drawing on, on your rather fractally layered body of knowledge. And I really appreciate you taking the time to have a chat with a fellow Aussie, so to speak, and someone from Mullen as well. And it's been a lot of fun and very insightful. And I'm sure that people are going to have to listen to this at least twice. And the more the better to get as much out of it as possible. So, ladies and gentlemen, this has been Dan Winter. Dan, thank you so much, mate. It's been fantastic. And hopefully we can do this again soon.
Yeah, I like you. I need to learn to make an accent like that because I think I do better, actually. No, your interest is really sincere, and I'm grateful to work with you. Thank you. Thank you.
It's a
Blessings.
pleasure. It's a
And
pleasure,
happy
mate.
to meet your audience. Thank you, guys. Bye.
Thank you,
Stay in
mate.
touch. Bye-bye.
Yes, absolutely. All right, mate. I'll leave you to it. Have a good one.
See ya. Bye-bye.
Bye. Do you ever wonder how to accelerate your growth, healing, and evolution without hard work, meditation, or spending thousands? Over my years as a conscious seeker, I've encountered one DNA activation and healing method that stands out above the rest and does just that. It's a uniquely potent evolutionary modality that helped me break out of feeling blocked and disconnected, allowing me to unfold more and more of my potential and true self, as well as deepening my spiritual connection, enhancing my energy levels, and more fully activating my body's healing mechanisms. It also remedied a major but little known energetic blockage which most people have but don't even realize. Now this convenient transformational method forms the core of my Evolve Yourself course, which has helped hundreds of spiritually awake people to accelerate their growth and evolution with minimal effort or cost. Learn everything you need to know at evolveyourself.live.